show that they're not too eager to negotiate in order to set the stage and get the upper hand tactically.
His subsequent remarks did seem to leave open the door for diplomacy, for even a resumption of the summit.
I still think that we're on a diplomatic track.
North Korea's really long-standing policy on unilateral disarmament.
North Korea publicly destroyed its nuclear test site.
Be looked at as a symbolic gesture, not as a substantive move towards denuclearization.
Scientists and other experts would have to get access to take sampling and core samples, etc.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. President Donald Trump canceled the planned summit with the leader of North Korea, citing the country's open hostility. President Trump at the same time left open the possibility to reschedule the summit. North Korea in response said it is still willing to hold a summit with the U.S. at any time. Today we'll discuss what all this means and where we're headed.
Many things can happen, and a great opportunity lies ahead potentially. I believe that this is a tremendous setback for North Korea and indeed a setback for the world.
Now my guest today, Dr. Patrick McEachern, fellow at the 윌슨센터. Dr. McEachern formerly served as North Korea analyst at the State Department and is the co-author of a recent book, North Korea, Iran, and the Challenge to International Order. Also joining us today, Mr. Bruce Klingner, senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Klingner spent 20 years in the intelligence community and was CIA's deputy division chief for Korea. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you for having us.
Now, Bruce, President Trump canceled the meeting, but then North Korea said it is willing to meet at any time, and President Trump called this warm and productive. And now President Trump is saying that the two sides are talking again. So where do we stand? I mean, how do two sides feel about holding the summit now?
Well, I think all of us who focus on Northeast Asia are getting a case of whiplash this year, sort of going from the brink of war to the seeming brink of peace, cancellation, resumption. So it's sort of, if you stand more than 10 feet away from your Twitter feed, you don't know what's going on. But the president's letter yesterday and in his subsequent remarks did seem to leave open the door for diplomacy, for even a resumption of the summit. So with North Korea having a fairly conciliatory response, it seems like we could get back on track for discussions, perhaps even the summit itself.
Mm-hmm. Patrick, how do you see that? Was President Trump really ready to walk off?
No, I think that this was probably a tactical move to try to set the stage for future U.S. DPRK diplomacy. I'd say that this is sort of like a roller coaster ride, and this was more of a dip than the ride coming to an end. Mm-hmm. And the two sides are trying to fill each other out, show that they're not too eager to negotiate in order to set the stage and get the upper hand tactically.
Bruce, was President's letter to North Korea yesterday, was it effective in fending off North Korea's past bad negotiating habits of blusterings and threats?
It could be seen as that, but a problem with it, though, is that our South Korean ally was blindsided. They had to have an emergency meeting at midnight of the National Security Council, and the president said he was unaware of what had happened, and they were perplexed by the U.S. policy. That's not a good way to run an alliance.
Mm-hmm. Patrick, why did the White House not tell them, the allies?
Yeah, well, we actually have quite a bit of conflicting reports on what type of pre-negotiations or pre-notification there was to the allies. A senior Japanese official said yesterday here in Washington that they had gotten advance notice, while the spokesperson in South Korea indicated that South Korea had not. It's hard to figure out exactly what sort of consultations took place in advance of this letter or pre-notifications. But I agree with Bruce that it's absolutely critical that the United States discuss these issues with its allies to make sure that there's no daylight between Washington and Seoul, and also between Washington and Tokyo if we're going to effectively deal with the North Koreans.
Mm-hmm. Patrick, for President Trump to cancel the meeting, was the difference in ideas in denuclearization, was this a major factor in the breakdown?
Yeah, I think it was. President Trump's letter referred to open hostility from the North Koreans, their most recent statement that objected to the U.S. use of the Libya model for denuclearization. The North Koreans have been on record for many years objecting to the Libya model as they see it as a precursor to regime change, since Gaddafi ultimately was killed after he gave up his nuclear program. So they very rudely criticized the vice president following last week's very rude criticism of the National Security Advisor on the same grounds of discussion of this Libya model. I certainly don't want to make any excuses for North Korean rudeness, but I would say that it's the norm that North Korean statements are sexist, racist, and insulting. And so this really wasn't outside of the North Korean norm, and I don't think that there had been really anything fundamental that had changed in North Korea's position.
Mm-hmm. Bruce, just hours before President Trump canceled the meeting with North Korea, he actually was on Fox and said that he's actually open to phased denuclearization model. So do you think President Trump may show some flexibility this time and try to meet with North Korea in mid-ground?
Well, there's a lot of conflicting statements recently on what U.S. policy is towards North Korea, which has been the case for the last year and a half. We have differing views between the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, and the President, and some of them even contradicting themselves. So, although the North Korean insulting and threatening statements were what I think a lot of people focused on, I think the most important statement, though, came from First Vice Foreign Minister Kim Kye-gwan. And what he very clearly and publicly stated was North Korea's really long-standing policy on denuclearization, that it's part of global arms control, not unilateral disarmament. Korea watchers have known this for years. North Koreans have told many of us that in person. But I think it came as a surprise to the President and to the White House. And so they reacted by saying, we thought this was going to be easy. Maybe if we can't win the game, maybe we just shouldn't play.
Mm-hmm. Bruce, President Trump mentioned to President Xi several times that Kim Jong-un changed his attitude after meeting with President Xi for the second time. Do you think China has a role in this breakdown?
I think that really is a misunderstanding of the nature of the North Korean-Chinese relationship. North Korea requested that second summit, and I think it was more to coordinate policy before the summit meeting between the U.S. and North Korea, just as the South Korean and U.S. leaders recently met in order to do the same. I don't think China dictates to North Korea its policy, and I don't think it would have tried to influence North Korea to go tough again. If anything, they were very welcoming of the softening of the North Korean position.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Patrick, President Moon Jae-in was in Washington this week to keep the summit on track, but now that we're facing some hiccups, does it make President Moon failed in his mediating role?
I think it's premature to say that that President Moon has failed in his efforts because the ride has not come to a stop, because the U.S.-DPRK engagement is not completely off. I think that there's still prospects for U.S.-DPRK engagement later this year, and the news from this morning suggests that it might even be just a few weeks away still. So I think that President Moon will continue to double down on his efforts to get the U.S. and North Korea into the same room. And then probably after that, continue his own efforts to have inter-Korean engagement as well.
Mm-hmm. Bruce, do you think the South Koreans, when they relayed message from North Korea to Washington, maybe some of the messages were overblown because North Korea's Choi Sun-hee says that it's Washington who wanted the summit, whereas President Trump said no, it's Pyongyang who wanted the summit. So why do we see this gap?
Well, it's sort of like the children's game telephone, where each person speaks to the next one in line, and the message along the path may get distorted. There is some concern that perhaps South Korea was overstating North Korea's eagerness. But I think even if you look at the South Korean public declaration of the message that it provided to President Trump, to Korea watchers it was very clear there was high conditionality that North Korea had attached to its denuclearization, which is standard. Not only the long list of demands that they would want, but even just the overall context of we will go down to zero when the rest of the nuclear club goes down to zero is again long-standing policy. So even if South Korea perhaps oversold North Korea's eagerness, I think clearly in the message there was that underlying standard North Korean policy.
Patrick, so where do we go from here? Are we closer to military confrontation, or are we still on diplomatic track?
I still think that we're on a diplomatic track, although I think that that diplomacy certainly has been put back a little bit since really 24 hours ago. So I think it's too early just to really talk about returning to the belligerence of last year, when there was a more open discussion of military options, which I think would be really quite disastrous for the Korean Peninsula, and that hopefully we can get to a more productive diplomatic negotiations to address this nuclear issue.
Bruce, do you think President Trump should have pulled out from the summit with North Korea? Would that have been a better idea?
Well, we're really in uncharted waters in so many ways. The normal way to have gone into a summit would have been a bottom-up approach, where lower-level officials meet, you hammer out any differences, or you identify the differences, and perhaps kick it up to the next level, either to resolve those differences or to continue making progress. The president threw that diplomatic playbook out and went for a top-down approach. In 2000, when I was attending White House meetings after North Korea had invited President Clinton, there was the more traditional way of, even if they thought we could get some progress, you don't deploy a president to negotiate, you deploy a president to sign an agreement where you know all the aspects of it. So, in a lot of ways, we're really just sort of learning as we go here.
Patrick, what do you think? Do you think President's better off to just walk out of the meeting?
At this point, no, I don't think it's wise to walk out of the meeting. I think that if the United States did that unilaterally, then it would be it would create a lot of troubles for our South Korean ally. The Chinese would, I think, blame the United States for effectively the breakdown of this diplomatic process, and would support the North Koreans more solidly. So I think that the prospects of putting greater pressure on North Korea, if the U.S. is seen as the cause of disrupting what could have been a productive process, really puts us in a much worse situation than we were prior to the president's accepting of this summit invitation.
Well, we'll end this conversation here and watch video for our next discussion. Now, just hours before President Trump announced the cancellation of the meeting, North Korea publicly destroyed its nuclear test site. Now, Patrick, what is the significance of this move in the overall diplomatic process?
I think it's a confidence building measure, and it should be looked at as a symbolic gesture, not as a substantive move towards denuclearization. The North Koreans were effectively trying to set the stage, I think, for the US DPRK summit and create a positive atmosphere with this gesture, just like they were with the release of the 3 unjustly detained American prisoners. I think it's analogous to the moves that North Korea made in advance of the Inter-Korean summit as well, but really shouldn't be seen as a substantial and irreversible move towards the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
Bruce, adding on to that, does it have any meaning in the technical sense of disarming and denuclearization?
No, North Korea. I think we should welcome it as a positive move, more diplomatic than a technical. As Patrick points out, it's not irreversible ending of their nuclear program. And really, the most important point is that North Korea said they no longer need to test because they've already crossed the finish line of having a nuclear weapon and a nuclear ICBM. So from their declaration, it's, we don't need to test anymore because we've already achieved it, as opposed to before we cross that line, we'll stop short.
Patrick, a senior White House official pointed out that North Korea broke its promise to invite experts for verification of the dismantlement. What is the concern here that the experts were not there?
Well, I think that we first need to put this in perspective and recall that this is a North Korea unilateral concession. So they were not getting anything in return in a substantial or concrete way for doing this. So the fact that they destroyed the tunnels, I think, as Bruce said, really should be welcome. Certainly there would have been preferable if it wasn't simply journalists there, but experts from the International Atomic Energy Agency or the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization. But at the end of the day, we 24 hours ago, we saw that North Korea had a known nuclear test site, and today they do not. So we should welcome that as positive.
But what about the concerns and criticisms that all the evidence are now gone, that the test site is gone? Bruce?
Well, if we do get to an agreement, we're going to need very robust verification regime, which we have lacked in previous agreements with North Korea. It needs to be more along the lines of what we had in arms control treaties with the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact. So there's a long list of requirements of what we need. So if we do get to that level with the North, what we'd have to do is a data declaration, interviewing a scientist, receiving documents, and then inspections of both declared facilities and then challenge inspections of non-declared facilities. Certainly the nuclear test site would be a declared site, and scientists and other experts would have to get access to those tunnels to take sampling and core samples, et cetera.
Patrick, I'm looking at the photos, and people call it a made-for-TV show, but I didn't see it so extravagant. But how can we compare the latest demolition to the demolition of the cooling tower at the Yongbyon in 2008?
I think it's a good parallel. One obvious difference is that the tunnels were underground and the cooling tower was above ground. So just from a TV optics point of view, blowing up the cooling tower was more spectacular. But they were similar in the respect that blowing up the cooling tower was a temporary and reversible move, that it precluded the North Koreans from restarting the reactor for probably about 6 months. But in the end, the North Koreans decided not to restart the Yongbyon reactor until 2013. So there was a 6-year verified shutdown of that nuclear production facility. So hopefully that's good news in the sense that if the North Koreans follow suit and do something similar, hopefully we won't be seeing North Korean nuclear tests really for some time.
Bruce, now that we see some setbacks in diplomacy, do you think North Korea will return to missile testing and nuclear testing, or continue with this denuclearization steps?
Well, since President Trump's letter of just yesterday, North Korea came back with a fairly conciliatory response, and the president has welcomed that. So it seems like the diplomatic train perhaps just had a temporary, push into a sidetrack rather than a total derailment. So I think it is too early to talk about the U.S. resumption of advocacy for a preventive military strike, or that North Korea is going to resume missile testing. So we may still be on the diplomatic train. It may just have been slowed or hit a few snags in the track.
Well, we'll end this conversation here and move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, a time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a picture of Palma Hotel in Wonsan City, North Korea. This is the place where foreign journalists stayed overnight before traveling by train to the Punggye-ri nuclear test site. A Russian reporter tweeted this picture, saying the foreign reporters were greeted like royalty. The picture shows silverware and fried turtle. Patrick, what's your reaction?
I think this is a reminder of the great disparity between elites and how foreigners are treated in North Korea oftentimes, and the reality that most North Koreans face. Most North Koreans lack basic access to proteins, let alone access to fried turtle.
Bruce?
Exactly. It really is almost disgusting when you see the amount of food that are provided to visiting dignitaries or the media, when you think of how starvation, suffering the population is, and lacking basic not only human rights but nutrition, et cetera. So, to flaunt it like this really is I find quite disturbing.
Well, on that note, we'll end it here. Bruce, Patrick, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.